Hello again, audiobook people. I am Felix from the Audiobook Review Corner, and as the name implies, I review audiobooks. If you have seen any of the previous videos, or at least half of them, or if you know me at all, you knew what was coming. And it's here, and I am so excited to talk about this. It's time for The Witcher. And starting with the first book called Blood of Elves, which is the first part of the, I would call it series saga for the rest of this review. This book was written by Andrzej Sapkowski, and the audiobook is read by the incomparable Peter Kenny, and it was published by Orion Publishing and is about 11 hours long. Of course, at first we have to talk about the story, but I need to tell you some context about this. As of making this video, there are 8 international books from the Witcher series. A 9th is currently out in Poland, where the author is from, but this hasn't been translated yet into other languages. This is apparently coming at the end of this year. The first 2 published books in the Witcher series are short stories that give introductions to the characters and basically tell little, as I said, short stories before the actual series saga. This book, Blood of Elves, is the first of 5 books in the so-called series saga, and the remaining book is a prequel novel that's also before the series saga. The book starts with a conversation between a troubadour called Dandelion and his audience. This conversation gives a quick overview of what has happened in the short stories before the events of this particular book. Specifically, it mentions the war in the region of Sintra. Sintra was a small kingdom in the north that was attacked by the region of Nilfgaard in the south. Sintra couldn't hold against the overwhelming force that is Nilfgaard and falls alongside its queen Calanthe, the lioness. Even though she's a small child, Calanthe's granddaughter, Cyrilla, survives the onslaught and basically has to fend for herself for a bit. At this point, she's less than 10 years old, and her name is Cyrilla Fiona Ellen Rhiannon, and she's known as Ciri. As I said, she survives and flees and is looking for a man she's linked to by destiny, a witcher that's called Geralt of Rivia. A witcher is a bounty hunter, or basically an exterminator that specializes on killing monsters. As I said, all of this is from the short stories, and Dandelion uses these stories to write songs about and become more famous, spreading the name of Geralt through the land and making Geralt famous. After this conversation, one of Dandelion's audience members, called Ryans, attacks and interrogates Dandelion about the contents of his stories. Ryans is particularly interested in the parts that concern Ciri, and keeps asking more and more while torturing Dandelion. As he's being tortured, Dandelion gets saved by a passing sorceress. Her name is Yennefer Wengerberg, and she's very, very important to the story and also familiar to the people who've read the short stories, because she is Geralt's one and only love and his on-again, off-again girlfriend, and also a friend of Dandelion's. They know each other. Yennefer warns Dandelion to not mention Ciri anymore, because it would draw attention to Ciri, and that is quite dangerous, because Ciri is way, way more than an ordinary princess. The story then finally switches to the main characters, Geralt and Ciri. It explains what happens after the two of them meet in the short stories, and it basically tells the story of how Geralt took Ciri to the Witcher's home in Kaer Morhen. That is an old castle that's in ruins and that used to be the home of the Witcher School of the Wolf. That is where Witchers were trained and made. And yes, I say made on purpose, because Witchers all have mutation. They have been forcefully mutated in order to basically be able to keep up with the monsters, because the monsters are strong and fast and ordinary humans wouldn't make it. So in something called the Trial of the Grasses, the Witchers are fed basically poison, which, if it doesn't kill them, makes them much more fast and strong and endurable, and also immune to a lot of illnesses that would normally affect people. Think of it a bit as like the super soldier serum from Captain America, but not as powerful, with way more side effects, way more dangerous and lethal, and far less accepted by society, because usually witchers are seen as a necessary evil by the people who hire them, so the villagers. One part of the reason for that is that the mutations are commonly believed to strip the witchers of emotions. About 3 years later, the witchers and Ciri receive a visitor at Kaer Morhen, another sorceress like Yennefer by the name of Triss Merigold. She's a friend and a short-time lover of Geralt's, and she came because the Witchers called her for 2 reasons. Firstly, they notice a magical ability in Ciri, where she would go into a trance and prophesy, which Triss also finds out immediately before she even arrives at Kaer Morhen. She already finds that out. And the second reason is because they don't know what to do with the girl that's starting puberty, because none of the Witchers want to give Ciri the necessary mutations, which it would be time for now. Geralt comes up with a plan to have Ciri transferred to a temple school in Elendor and get watched over by a priestess and get an education, and Triss agrees with that. But not without acknowledging that they need help from another sorceress that's even more powerful than and experienced than Triss, and they both know that Triss means Yennefer. So, after they agree, the three of them leave Kaer Morhen together for Elendor, and they meet up with an old friend of Geralt's, just by coincidence, a dwarf named Jorpen Sigrin, and they join his company to take off properly with the story. And if the team reaches the temple school in Elendor, what happens on the way, and how Rience and Yennefer contribute to the story again, you will have to read for yourself. It's time for the book critique, and front up, it's no secret, I'm a big fan of The Witcher. You already know this since I've mentioned this series in about half the videos I've made until now, and it's no surprise that my review will be quite positive. The world building isn't particularly pronounced in this book, but that just leaves the reader a lot of room for the imagination. And since I played Witcher 3 before I read the books, I kind of adapted this image to the lands, which of course, the game was made basically with the blessing of the author. This fits the world incredibly well. The characters are great and believable, and they range from badass to silly to cartoonishly evil, and I love all of it. The reader also gets a good overview of who is who and what the basic story is, even though you've probably not read the first two books. But keeping these people in mind, I do need to say that some of the characters could have been introduced a little bit more, with a little more attention to how they relate to Geralt and who this person is. A good example for that is Yennefer. She gets only a very vague introduction in this book. And I feel that the readers who are starting with this particular book could have profited from at least a quick summary of what the story between Yennefer and Geralt, and maybe even Yennefer, Geralt, and Dandelion is, which is a great story in itself. The book also establishes quite an interesting political system with the different kingdoms, and makes some great points on if you should enter a conflict that you have no stake in. And it's really, really interesting because Geralt is politically neutral, like all the Wolf School Witchers. Geralt has about this a great discussion with Jorpen Sigrin, and these discussions give a lot of hints to the type of person Geralt is. And what I also like about this book is the humor that creeps into the book at times. Anyone who's read Yennefer's letter to Geralt will know immediately what I'm talking about. Very, very briefly, Geralt follows Triss's advice and writes to Yennefer that he needs her help with Ciri. And he doesn't know how to start the letter because, as I said, Yennefer is his on-again, off-again girlfriend, and they've hit kind of a rough patch. And so he starts the letter with the words, "Dear friend." And this infuriates Yennefer, and she writes a letter back that is a masterclass in satire. She uses the phrase "dear friend" in this letter like 30 times, and it's genius, and it's comedic gold. Her reactions and constant jabs at this greeting are absolutely hilarious. And since the book's tones are generally way more serious than humorous, and the humor is used sparingly, it shines even brighter. This is about as far as I can take this critique because of the book's status as setup for the rest of the story. There simply isn't much more to say. This, of course, means that this book isn't perfect either. Sometimes it goes on a little bit too much, like roughly in the middle, for example, Geralt goes on a complete side quest on a boat, and this whole section could have been cut from the book without hurting it whatsoever. It's also important to mention that it's the book-spanning arc that I love, not just the individual books. And this is quite the big downfall for this book in particular. This sometimes reminds me of the Marvel Universe again, where this book sets up the other 4 books in this series fantastically well, but it suffers from the situation itself because the setup is very methodical and slow, but if the rest of the series wouldn't exist, this book wouldn't be as popular as it is now because it doesn't stand on its own merit enough. I think a good example for this is Ryans. He should have been the main antagonist of this book, and he is, but his storyline isn't really finished, or it's not even hinted that it will continue, because at the end of this book, Ryans just disappears. This isn't particularly well done, and Ryans won't be the reason you pick up the next book. Let's agree on that. Currently, this point is a book hard for me to make, because I think that Ryans's comeuppance in the later book, the resolution of his storyline, is fantastic and incredibly well done, but at this particular book, I don't think it's done very well. But looking at this book in isolation, it's kind of unresolved and to me leaves something to be desired. Another way this reminds me of the Marvel universe is that we get little hints and pieces and Easter eggs towards the short story books. A good example for that is the character of Jorben Sigrin, because even though it's hardly mentioned in this book, Geralt and Yennefer and Dandelion know him from a shared adventure a few years ago that involved a dragon, which is also a very good short story. Now, moving on to the characters. And first of all, we need to talk about the man, the myth, the legend himself, Geralt of Rivia. In this book, Geralt doesn't give much of the things I really like about him. Geralt had some very nice philosophical moments, and you definitely start to see his role as a father figure for Ciri, but in this book this doesn't reach much beyond his role as a mentor or teacher for Ciri. But he has some very incredible lines in this book. For example, on his neutrality he says, "To be neutral is not to be indifferent and insensitive. You don't have to kill the emotions within you, you just have to kill your hatred." And there really is wisdom in what Geralt says, and it really shows his age, because Witchers are much older than regular humans, or can be. But on occasion you do see what kind of a good guy Geralt is when he's caring for Triss. Also, you can clearly see that Geralt isn't the emotionless mutant he pretends to be when he talks to Triss about Yennefer and shares his feelings about her, which is a very, very poignant moment. The next character I would like to mention is Ciri, and for Ciri I kind of feel bad in this book. Before the book even starts, she is an orphan of war. She used to be a princess, but now she's nothing but a regular person struggling to survive. After she finds her destiny-appointed guardian and catches a little break, she immediately starts having problems with prophesying, and she suffers nightmares from her experiences. But at least she enjoys her time with the Witchers at Kaer Morhen. She then has to leave her new home that she enjoys so much and get separated from everyone she knows again to move to a school where she has nobody. But even on top of that, Ciri then gets taken in by Yennefer, a person who apparently hates her for her connection to Geralt, which Ciri can't do anything about, since it was Destiny who chose this. But Ciri still keeps her wits about her, she's smart, she's tough for a little child, she's curious and incredibly brave. My favorite scene with Ciri is also one of my favorite scenes with Triss. When Triss goes to Kaer Morhen, she realizes that the Witchers failed to notice Ciri's development. Ciri has her period at the moment, and this impacts her performance in training. And Triss just goes off on the Witchers and dresses them down how they could possibly be so insensitive to not realize what their ward is doing or going through. And after Triss dresses down the Witchers, those tough monster hunters, to be this tall, Ciri then enters the room and gives a rehearsed speech. Her once real but now fake regality, her mock confidence and her choice of words is just great. The whole scene is very, very enjoyable, and Ciri is generally a very well written young girl. In fact, I actually asked my wife if we should give our daughter the middle name Ciri, because my wife is just as big of a Witcher fan as I am, but in the end we decided against it. Before I talk about Triss, I will have to give you a warning. Specifically, if you have played the games and have not read the books, this scene will make you wonder if we're talking about the same person. And I promise you we are. Triss is probably the one that's changed most from the books to the game or the Netflix show. A quick example of this is that in the book it's mentioned several times that Triss has chestnut hair, so brown. In the game she's a very well-known redhead. But that's not all. Her character is entirely different. So much so that I have to be honest and say I didn't really like Triss in this book. She has her moments where she dresses down the Witchers, for example, but in general her character is pretty weird. The most obvious is her unbelievable thirst for Geralt, which is super annoying. She desperately throws herself into his arms, and she openly acknowledges that she envies Yennefer for her relationship with Geralt. And this just doesn't fit the character at all. Even when she's very sick and Geralt has to properly care for her, she tries to get him to sleep with her. And I'm not talking sick like she has a cold and Geralt brings her soup. She has food poisoning and has terrible diarrhea for days straight, and she's super weak and has a fever, and Geralt has to wipe her ass for her. Even then, she tries to get Geralt to hook up with her. And come on, girl, that's just desperate. There also is a small line in the book that I think should be given more attention, because Triss basically admits to raping Geralt. She thinks about how she had to use magical aids to seduce him, and this is a huge red flag. Yennefer, on the other hand, is very much the same woman as in the game. She is so sure of herself that it can be seen as arrogant or bitchy, but she's also incredibly smart, she has fantastic wit, and she's always very sincere. She also spots Ciri's potential immediately and is always very fair to Ciri, even though Ciri doesn't see it yet. And we, as the reader, have the feeling that Yennefer doesn't like Ciri. Still, she's being fair to her. For example, Yennefer tells Ciri that she expects absolute honesty from Ciri. But in return, Yennefer is incredibly honest with Ciri as well, and she will answer any question that Ciri asks of her. And she does do that very well. But even though Yennefer is one probably of the most emotional people in this entire series, she does have a logical bone, because sorceress is a position that derives very much from science, and she uses her capability for logic as well when Mother Nenneke of the temple in Elendor tells her that Ciri isn't a competition for her. And from that point on, her relationship with Ciri changes for the better. And I have to mention it again, I said it before, I'm a big fan of Yen's wit. She can be hilarious when she wants to. Her letter to Geralt is just a fantastic showcase of her style of humor, and even though Geralt doesn't really like the letter and to him it's scathing, for the reader it's just comedic wildfire. I've read this book like 5 times and I still laugh every time I read it. Or hear it. I would love to talk about the minor characters in this book like Yarp and Sigrin, Mother Nenneke, Philippa Eilhart or the other Witchers, but this review will already be very long and I just can't do that. But just for the protocol, my ranking of the other Witchers is Eskel, Vesemir, Lambert, Cohen. Moving on to the actual audiobook, starting with the acting, and I can say this part of the review will be very short. The audiobook is a prime example how a great actor can heighten a book. In this particular case, Peter Kenny turns a good book into a great audiobook. Kenny can basically do no wrong. His acting talent is immense, and all the emotions the characters portray are done as close to perfection as they possibly could be. Especially during the more exciting scenes, Kenny adds drama spectacularly when he speeds up with the narration, for example. But he does way more than that because of his incredible character portrayals. I have one small complaint about this performance. I will address this in the loose thoughts section, but for now, I can only say that I really like his version of Geralt. And if Doug Cockle, who is Geralt's voice from the games, would ever hang up his mantle, Kenny could take over in a heartbeat with basically no one complaining. The narration he does is spectacular, and especially in the fighting scenes when Kenny picks up speed and adds more drama, it's an absolute joy to listen. My favorite performance of his is Ciri, though. Meaning absolutely no disrespect, Peter Kenny isn't a young man exactly, and when he voiced the books, he was probably at least 40, if not older. And that makes his portrayal of a little girl even more impressive. It's not entirely fair to bring this up during this book's critique, but in the short stories, Geralt and Ciri meet before the events of Sintra. And in this particular point in time, Ciri is like 8 to maybe 10, and his portrayal of her is just unbelievable, and I absolutely love it. He also does great work with accents. And I don't know enough about these accents to say which character has which regional accent, because it's different types of British, but I can tell you that they sound different, and the factions generally have different accents. For example, all the dwarves have the same accent, which are sometimes more pronounced, sometimes less, and it just works incredibly well. The acting range Peter Kenny shows is simply astonishing. He reaches from low and grovelly for Geralt to high and excited and stubborn for Ciri, and to ridiculous and over the top when he portrays a scholar on the boat scene that I mentioned before. And it's just fantastic. His control over his vocal cords grants him like considerable tonal range, and he easily switches between 12-year-old girl and grovelly old man, and even monstrous voices to everything in between. And if you add the accent work on top of that, you have characters that are as distinct as they possibly could be. I mentioned in the last video that there are some actors who perform so well that you forget that it's one person, and this is definitely the case here. Speaking of accents, I mentioned this before, all the dwarves have the same accent, and they're Welsh apparently. I had to look that up, I didn't know about this. Ciri has a slight Scottish accent, which I was able to pick up. And at least from what I could Google, Geralt has a Yorkshire accent, if that's interesting to you. But even characters who are less pronounced accent-wise and have the same or a similar register are still distinct. A good example for this are Triss and Yennefer. And due to Yennefer's tone of collected superiority, you are always able to say who is speaking at which point. These two women don't share a scene in this, they will do in other books, but you can definitely tell them apart. The next point, as usual, is the production. And if this book would be perfect, it would just shatter me. But fortunately, it is. No botched lines, no cutting mistakes, no background noises. It's just a perfect audiobook. And as in the Hunger Game review, it's quite impressive that this is the case, considering that this version was and still is on YouTube. And I've mentioned before how YouTube usually has slightly less production quality, because if it's uploaded by a fan, they have to cut chapters together, and there's almost always mistakes. But in this case there isn't, which again leads me to believe that there's one source file that's been uploaded. In the very first review I made on the book Imposter Syndrome, I promised I'll mention the reading speed if it's ever relevant, because usually I listen to the books on 1.15 times the normal speed. And in this case I didn't, because YouTube doesn't have this particular option of speed. And it doesn't hurt the book at all. In fact, I think it does make the book feel slightly slow for me, but I think that's just because I'm used to the 1.15 times. It's perfectly adequate and nobody else but me would even notice this, but coming from this, it feels kind of slow, but it's not a problem. The next point in the critique is the attention retention, and the attention retention, or the AR in this book, is very, very good. Kenny's vocal work and the engaging characters and the good story combine into a fantastic listening experience. Especially in the action-rich parts, I think it's almost impossible to turn off the book. It would be, in this case, that I'm wearing my headphones, my wife comes in and says, "The apartment is on fire, we have to go," and I say, "Let me just finish this chapter, please." Moving on to some loose thoughts. I have praised Peter Kenny's performance, and I mean every word of it. But one thing I just have to mention. Kenny pronounces dandelion as dandelion, and it's driving me a bit crazy. Kenny explains why he does this in an interview, and that helps a bit, but you still notice it. It's like driving your car on a highway and you hit a pebble. It's not dangerous to you, it won't derail anything, but you notice it's there. If you're in any way like me and you like voice acting and the more technical side of production, I highly recommend this podcast that's called Breakfast in Beauclair, and it has both Peter Kenny, so the narrator of the audiobooks, and Doug Cockle, the voice of Geralt from the games, and they have a conversation of acting and The Witcher in general, and it's highly recommendable. And I listened to the whole thing twice, even though I absolutely hate podcasts. Another loose thought I have is that I think it's pretty universal that as parents we try to give our kids what we enjoy. For example, my father tried to instill his taste in music in me, and my wife and I are definitely trying to integrate some Witcher into my daughter's life. For example, this doll of her is called Philippa. And we also bought this book from CDPR, the developer of the game, and this book is fantastic. I can highly recommend this for your kids. There are only two problems about this situation. First, our daughter is a baby, so she's too young even for this. And secondly, this is for kids up until like maybe 10, maybe 8 to 10, about this range, and there's nothing after that but the proper book series, and we're sure as hell not gonna read that to her when she's 10. So CDPR, if you're listening, please release something for smaller kids or like teens, for example, young teens. You have, let's say, about 10 years, and please take your time, but I would love it if you could release something. Next up is the relistening chance, and the relistening chance for this book is 100%. If I don't get hit by a bus soon, I will definitely listen to this book as part of the overall saga again. This was my 4th or 5th time listening to it, and I still love it. And even if I would stop with the reviews tomorrow, I would still listen to the end of the series because I've started now. Now it's time for the overall scoring of this audiobook. It won't surprise you that this will probably be very high. And as usual, we're starting with the story. The story will get 8 out of 10 points from me. I really like the book, and I think it's a great setup for the rest of the story, and what is there is good. But it doesn't focus on itself enough, and what isn't there is hurting the book a little bit. The acting will receive 10 points. There's absolutely nothing that I could say negative about this. Even the dandelion thing is charming in its own way, but my inner monk still cries every time I hear it. The production will fortunately also get 10 points, and the AR will receive 9 points out of 10. I would give the AR 10 points if I liked this particular book story a bit better, but sometimes it just lost me. For example, in the very beginning, as I said, the conversation that basically recaps the short stories, that's too long. You could still cut this by half and it would be just as informative. Running all those values through the formula, we get an overall score of 9.25 points out of 10. The highest score yet, and in words, this means this audiobook gets a recommendation of an absolute must listen. If you're a fantasy fan at all, listen to the Witcher books. You will love them. I said this in the beginning, everyone who knows me or my interests absolutely knew what was coming, and I'm so glad I did it. I got to talk about The Witcher, and there's no better excuse to dive back into these books. Thank you for watching. Let me know if you liked this audiobook or if you have any reviews you would like me to do. I do have a significant backlog on what I plan to review in the future, but if something is asked of me, I will definitely put it on there with priority. This is the 5th video, so the last of the pre-prepared ones. I will now upload all these videos, and then the new videos will have to be in real time. The thing is, we have a small baby at home, I've mentioned this before, so please don't expect a regular upload schedule, but whenever I have time I will work on these videos and on this channel, and if possible I will try to at least do 1 video a month. And in the future, when I have my 2nd parental leave slot, maybe I can do a little more in that time. Have a great day, keep your ears open for a good audiobook, and go listen to The Witcher. Bye!